Well, greetings, everyone. This is Robin Millsap Osborne at Michigan State University, and I'm welcoming you today to the EAB University's Spring 2019 webinar series, which is funded by the USDA Forest Service. Along with my EAB University colleagues, Cliff Sadoff and Elizabeth Barnes from Purdue University, and Amy Stone from The Ohio State University, we welcome you to today's webinar on an update on ticks, diseases, and prevention, which is presented by Tim McDermott from Ohio State University Extension. Dr. McDermott is an OSU Extension Educator in Agriculture and Natural Resources. He has been in Franklin County, Ohio, the last year and a half, after 2 years in Hocking County. Prior to joining Extension, he practiced small animal private practice veterinary medicine and surgery in Central Ohio for more than 20 years. He has lectured on insect vectored disease at both Ohio State and Ohio University, as well as for corporations and public entities such as the Ohio Department of Agriculture, Glatfelter Corporation, American Electric Power, the Ohio Forestry Association, and numerous regional and county public health organizations. If you have questions for Tim during the presentation, please type them in the Q&A feature, and he will respond to them after the webinar presentation. After today's webinar, you will be emailed a link to a short, voluntary, confidential survey that we hope you will take the time to fill out, as well as information on how to get CEUs and CCH credits. The survey helps us bring these free educational webinars to you. Thank you for attending today. And Tim, if you have unmuted your mic, please begin your presentation.
Thanks, Robin. Can everybody hear me okay, hopefully? What I'm going to be talking about is an update on ticks. And I'm going to be coming at this topic from the perspective of a clinician. I practiced veterinary medicine for over 20 years here in Central Ohio, and I'll apologize for any out-of-state guests that there's quite the Ohio flavor with this presentation. But as a veterinarian, we deal with insect vectored or tick vectored diseases extremely often during a day, where we're seeing a patient every 10 or 15 minutes, and pretty much every exam or consultation involves something where we're talking about insect or tick vector diseases. What spurred talking about this and the generation of this presentation was when I first started an extension in the fall of 2015, I was planning some naturalist programming down in Hocking County, and I had mentioned to the group that I was with there that I needed to get out the pants that I normally wear when I'm out in the woods or out in the pasture and treat them for ticks with a spray. And these are folks that spend a lot of time out in the woods, and they had started to ask me questions about why I would do that and where we're at in terms of ticks right now. And what I found that has not really matched the awareness is the spread of new invasive tick species and the increase in the amount of diseases that ticks vector to humans, livestock, and companion animals has increased dramatically in the last 10 years. Back when I was a kid, you didn't really worry too much if you were exposed to a tick. You would go in the woods or you would go in a field, you'd get a tick on you, you'd pull it off, it was gross, but you didn't really have to spend too much time worrying about catching a tick vector disease. When I was in private practice about 10 years ago, we were approached by one of the drug companies that make vaccines, and they asked us if we would like to carry the Lyme vaccine for dogs. And then we started talking about how many cases of Lyme did we actually see in practice. Having no good data, that company offered to test. When we did a heartworm test in dogs, which is testing for a mosquito vectored disease into dogs, they would do a Lyme test for each heartworm test that we did. And over that year's period, we did 10,000 tests for Lyme disease in dogs, and we had 0 positives 10 years ago. Fast forward to about 5 years, At this point in veterinary medicine, we have very good testing for ticks. We have rapid tests that we can do inexpensively, cage-side tests, a few drops of blood, a fairly short 15, 20-minute period to get results for multiple different ticks diseases. And we started seeing multiple positives for things like Rocky Mountain spotted fever, Lyme, or Ehrlichia canis. When I left practice to go full-time in extension last year, it was fairly common that every week in our practice group we would have a positive or multiple positives within the same dog for tick vector diseases. So what I'm trying to do as an educator is I'm trying to increase the outreach of where we're at now in terms of ticks, the invasive species we have, and the diseases that they transmit. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to do a little fast facts and get everybody up to speed on ticks right now. Ticks are common causes of vector diseases to multiple species, and they vector multiple different kinds of diseases. They can vector bacterial diseases. Fairly new, at least here in the United States, is viral diseases vectored by ticks. They also have a salivary carbohydrate component that in certain people, depending on the tick bite, you might contract an allergic syndrome that we'll talk a little bit about later on. And they carry lots of these different diseases. Generally not born with the disease, but that really depends on the disease. And what we're seeing is a lot of the research that is out there is mostly from the CDC, and it is around the black-legged tick, and it is around Lyme disease. But there are other ticks with other diseases that they will transmit transovarially, or they will transmit vertically into their babies. And in those instances, that's a tremendous force multiplier to how much disease can get into an environment, because if a tick is born without any disease and they need to get that disease from an infected host, that's a one-on-one transmission. But a female tick can lay clutches of eggs in the thousands, and if those eggs are all infective as they mature through their life cycle, that puts a tremendously larger amount of disease into the environment. And so as I build these presentations and as I talk, I need to really keep up to date on the research, because the research is showing a lot of rapidly emerging profiles, and a lot of what we thought prior was a truism is found with new research to not quite be true. Ticks are rapidly advancing in terms of their habitat and the diseases that they carry, and the research reflects that, but you got to stay up on top of that. So an interesting thing about ticks is they're not an insect, they're actually an arachnid. They have 4 pairs of legs, and that's very important to think about when you think about how they hunt. They hunt via a method called questing. What questing is picture a tick holding on to a leaf or a branch or a piece of vegetation with its back 2 pair of legs. The front 2 are poised to grab whatever their host prey is as that prey walks past. So they don't fly, they don't jump, and they don't run really fast. Basically what they do is when their prey walks by, they grab them. And that is very important to understand when you are thinking about how will I protect myself from ticks, knowing that they're not going to be out there sensing you flying around. Multiple different diseases are vectored by ticks, and for the most part, just about everything that a tick will vector to either a human, a producer, or their livestock or their companion animals are all fairly devastating diseases. Some very difficult ones to treat, some that can have some permanent complications if they're not caught in time. A lot of these are diseases that present through multiple organ systems, because they will get in and affect the white blood cells or the red blood cells or the platelets. And so a lot of the diseases that are vectored by ticks to their host are multi-organ system diseases. They can affect the neurologic system, they can cause arthritis, they can affect multiple different organ systems within the body. The first 4 on there are bacterial diseases that are vectored by ticks. There are a number of different viral disease syndromes that are vectored by ticks, and these are fairly new to the United States. while they have been present over in Asia for a number of years, there are certain diseases over here like Heartland or Powassan virus that are fairly new. Generally, when a tick vectors a viral disease to its human host, those diseases are neurologic diseases, and they can cause damage to the central nervous system. They have a fairly high fatality rate if the immune system doesn't fight that off, and unfortunately, they also have a fairly high rate of permanent complications. And then there are the allergic syndromes that we'll talk about, the alpha-gal or mammalian muscle allergy, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the Lone Star tick. And this is just a short list of them. There are numerous other diseases that ticks will vector to their human host, and generally they're all pretty disastrous. In fact, several of them were actually weaponized as bioweapons by the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So when we look at the life cycle of, well, we're going to look at the deer tick here. The deer tick is a 2-year life cycle, and it goes through its 3 hosts. It goes from the larval form to the nymphal form to the adult form. Not every tick is a 2-year life cycle. Some are 1-year life cycle. But the take-home point that I used in practice when I would talk to clients is ticks are not just a summer problem here in Ohio or in the Midwest. Ticks can cause problems because they will feed all year long as they migrate through their maturation cycle. There is data in Ohio that Lyme disease has been definitively diagnosed as a positive case in all 12 months of the year here in Ohio. And when we look at the different swings in climate that we have, while there's going to be a decrease in the activity of ticks where they, in truly bitter cold, are going to migrate under organic matter and they're going to burrow down into the soil, they can emerge to feed fairly rapidly onto their host. We just had a weather swing here in central Ohio a week ago Sunday, where on Sunday it was 66 degrees and pleasant, although raining. And on Monday it dropped down to a low of 6 degrees the next day. So on that Sunday, if you were outside, you had a chance of exposure for ticks. So when I used to talk to my clients about making sure that they had prevention on their companion animals, a lot of clients, due to budgetary concerns, might take off the winter months, but I would caution them that they are still going to be at risk, either themselves or their companion animals, when they're out in all 12 months of the year. So feeding times on hosts are dependent on different life cycles of the host, or different life cycles of the tick. The larval forms are going to feed for about 3 to 6 days, the nymphal forms for 4 to 5 days, the adult forms for 7 to 10 days. The length of attachment does have a fairly linear correlation to disease transmission, assuming the tick is carrying that disease. And what that means is the longer that the tick is attached to the host and feeding, if that disease is present in the tick, the greater the chance that they're going to transmit that. And with most of the data that is out there, and that is from the CDC, and that is Lyme disease, what we found is that generally for that, if you can get the tick off within a 24-hour period, you have a fairly decent chance if it had a positive test result for carrying the disease. But what I counsel clients and what I counsel everybody when I do these presentations is you don't want to get bit by a tick at all. You don't want to have to worry or think about how long has that tick been embedded or how long has that tick been feeding. Ideally, you want to prevent any sort of tick bite whatsoever. And we're going to go over the strategies that you would use in order to try to minimize exposure to tick bites and prevent the bite completely. When I was referencing how a lot of the research data that I've read over the years is mostly about Lyme disease in deer ticks or black-legged ticks, there is some scholarly presentation articles that are out there that have done case studies in other diseases. And what we found is that depending on the tick, depending on the life cycle the tick is currently in, and depending on the disease that that tick is carrying, that there can be some variability that does not match up well with the 24-hour time period for disease transmission. I've seen scholarly articles where they have found anaplasmosis, another tick vector disease to humans and livestock, can be transmitted in as rapidly as 12 hours. And I've read a scholarly presentation that showed that Powassan virus, which is a tick vector neurologic disease, that nymphal deer ticks transmitted Powassan virus to mice in the laboratory in as little as 15 minutes. So while there is a correlation with how long a tick is on you, should it be positive with your chances of getting the disease transmitted to you, I think there's still a ways to go with research, and I keep my eyes open for new research as I see that. It all boils down to do your best job to not have any ticks bite you or stay embedded in you where you have a chance of that disease transmission. Back in private practice, and if you look at the labels of most of the products that are out there for flea and tick control, they're labeled to kill ticks within 24-hour time periods. And that is based on the research that they had as they were formulating these products. And so that is where we're at with the state of transmission prevention to this point. And so when I go to prevention of tick bites in general in humans and companion animals later on, we'll go over some strategies that can increase your success at avoiding the bite and avoiding disease. So here are the top 4 are the ticks most common to Ohio. All of those on the list here are hard-shelled ticks, and we're talking exclusively about hard-shelled ticks. There is another family of ticks called the soft-shelled ticks or Argus ticks. They predominantly are a pest of poultry, and while they will cause problems in poultry, that is not the focus of what we're talking on today. So we're going to talk about these 6 ticks. The top 4 are the most commonly found in Ohio and generally most commonly found in the Midwest, but I want to give an update on the last 2 as well so that folks can start thinking about them and start thinking about how they would develop programs or some outreach to address these, because the 2 on the list, the Gulf Coast tick and the longhorn tick, have some unique problems and challenges that they'll bring if they were to move into our range. So right up here, we're taking a look at the brown dog tick, and the brown dog tick is found in all 48 continental United States states. It is sort of the original one that we worked against in private practice back in the day, and it is a vector of multiple diseases to dogs and to humans, including Rocky Mountain spotted fever. It has a couple of unique things about it in that this is a tick that does not need to fall off and find different intermediate hosts in order to move through its life cycle. The brown dog tick can spend its entire life on its preferred host, which is the dog, meaning that you could have a female lay eggs, they would hatch into the larval form, they would mature through the nymphal form and into the female, all the while staying on the dog, and that dog will be its habitat and its food source. This is not as commonly encountered in practice now with the advent of a lot of the good tick medications that are out there, but we do see this in some of the working dogs that might be out in the field or out in the pasture, like a livestock guard dog that does not get as much one-on-one time with the owner. The American dog tick is very common in the Midwest and found in all states east of the Mississippi. This is a common transmitter of Rocky Mountain spotted fever, as well as numerous other bacterial and viral diseases. When I talk about ticks, I want to make sure that I don't pigeonhole tick habitat to being purely a woodland phenomenon, because that is not how ticks generally should be pigeonholed, and that might cause folks to not take the appropriate precautions. The American dog tick actually prefers a habitat closer to a grassy or a little more open habitat. The last 2 ticks that I found on myself in the last year were American dog ticks, and one of them was crawling up my leg when I was sitting in the lawn at our public pool waiting for my daughter to swim in a swim meet, and the other one was when I was sitting in a lawn chair on a driveway at a graduation party in the middle of summer. So both of them were found in more urban habitats and in places where it was a maintained lawn. The black-legged tick or the deer tick is one that there's been a lot of research done on, and this is because of the disease that a vector is called Lyme disease. And Lyme disease was named for Lyme, Connecticut, where there was an original hotspot of this. This has been studied tremendously, especially by New England research universities. And if you look in the bottom right corner of the slide, you'll see photo credit for an organization called tickencounter.org. Tickencounter.org is a University of Rhode Island maintained website, and what I consider the standard for websites that are out there where you can find resources in all states of identification, what to do if you find a tick, and tick removal, and how to get ticks tested, and how to do the prevention methods that are out there. So I want to thank them for doing an outstanding job at maintaining what I consider the standard for resources that are out there. So the black-legged tick or the deer tick is one tick that does prefer a woodland habitat. It usually feeds on different hosts. Its primary tiny mammalian host is the white-footed mouse, which is extraordinarily common in Ohio and the Midwest. And then as the tick matures and it moves up through its life cycles, it's going to feed on subsequently larger mammalian hosts. It can feed on dogs. It'll feed on livestock, including cattle and horses. It'll feed on people. Its preferred host is the white-tailed deer, and that's where it gets its name. It transmits Lyme disease, which is Borrelia burgdorferi. There's several other Borrelia species of bacteria, so generally it's accepted that there's what's known as Lyme borreliosis with multiple species of Borrelia that will transmit that disease. This is slightly old data, so this is the end of 2016, and these are the counties where the black-legged tick have been found in Ohio. And I like to have this slide up there because I want to use this to show topography. For any of our visitors that might not be from Ohio, Ohio has an interesting topography in that after the glaciers came, they caused several different distinct regions in Ohio. And this diagonal line where you see through this area, everything kind of below this is moving toward the Appalachian soil plateau. And up here in the Corn Belt area of Ohio, as we get closer to Lake Erie, this was all the prior Great Swamp. And so when we talk about black-legged ticks or deer ticks and their primary host as adults being deer, basically what we have is, this is Deer County area right here. And that is why we're seeing the majority of these counties have black-legged ticks being found in them. I can tell you that when you look at the data that goes up to just last month, they're starting to see pockets of different hotspots in the Corn Belt area. And I live in Franklin County right here, and I live in the city of Columbus, very close to downtown. Deer, which used to be a purely rural phenomenon, are now found pretty much everywhere in Ohio. This is due to increasing number of deer numbers. We don't have apex predators with wolves anymore, and the year after year hunting numbers with deer harvest in Ohio have been steadily decreasing for a number of years. For Lyme disease with black-legged ticks, there's a fairly decent correlation linearly with the amount of disease correlating with the amount of deer. And I can tell you that living very close to downtown, being able to walk downtown and see the buildings from my house, I have had deer, fox, and coyote on my street in just the last few months. This is a little more up to date. So this is October of 2017. And if I had time, I would have been embedded into this slide and changed it over to the January of 19 data that they have. But what we have is we're starting to see some hotspots right here. And this is the rate over the last 10 years. So when you see the darker colors here, you're seeing a lot more over the last 10 years. As this progresses, what we're seeing is a slowly darkening towards a darker orange of this whole region right here. Looking at the total number of Lyme disease positives in Ohio, when we go back to 2008, we have 45, and over that 10-year period, we've seen a 6-fold increase in diseases. And these are positive diagnosed diseases. A lot of literature that I read, they're suspicious that these numbers are tremendously underreported because in a lot of cases, because the testing did not used to be as easy to do in human medicine as it is in veterinary medicine, it was fairly common that if there was a suspicion of a tick vector disease, that they would simply be put on the antibiotics that are specific for those diseases, as opposed to doing some testing. I think what we'll see is now that they're streamlining and improving the testing in human medicine to what they have it now, which is a two-step with an ELISA and a Western blot, I think we're going to see a much more accurate reflection of the positive cases of Lyme disease. So the Lone Star tick is an interesting one, and here in Ohio, I don't have the exact data on it, but me monitoring this tick, what we found is it probably migrated up from the south to cross the river between 5 or 10 years ago. And this is not one that I would generally see very commonly in central Ohio in private practice at all 5 years ago, but it is extraordinarily common now in southern Ohio, and in fact it is found all the way through Ohio, all the way up to the lake, and is spreading further through the Midwest. It's very distinctive, with the female having this white spot on its back to locate that when it's walking on you. This is one that when I did a program in Vinton County, which is in southern Ohio, fairly close to the Ohio River, a couple of years ago, we did some tick collection by dragging corduroy through the woods along that tick edge habitat. And we collected hundreds of ticks, and every single one of them was the Lone Star tick. So like the other ticks, this one has its favorite diseases and things that it vectors, but the Lone Star tick here in Ohio is unique in that there is an allergic syndrome that it is associated with, and that a component in its saliva is fairly close to mammalian muscle carbohydrate. And what happens is, if you are bitten by this tick and it causes an immune reaction within yourself to that saliva, it can cause you to be allergic to mammalian muscle. The nickname for this disease is alpha-gal, or mammalian meat allergy. What happens in this case is you become allergic to mammalian meat, meaning you are no longer able to eat beef or pork or venison without the chances of a severe reaction to eating that meat. And that has only been around since around 2014. And the first time that I had heard about that disease was in a meeting of other veterinarians, where we were out at a restaurant, and the veterinarian next to me ordered the fish. And he explained that the reason that he had done that was within the last year, and he was a veterinarian and a tick researcher, he had gotten bitten by a Lone Star tick and contracted that allergic syndrome. They don't really have good data on how long the allergy is going to persist. They don't know if it's a 5-year or 10-year, or if it's a lifetime allergy, because the syndrome is so new in terms of when it was discovered. So the Lone Star tick is gradually increasing its host range, and this is also from 2016 CDC data. I've seen some reports that it has gone further up into the Great Lakes region up here, and that would not surprise me. The Lone Star tick is very similar in its habitat needs as the deer tick. It likes that wooded habitat more. It is noted for being a much more aggressive biter than the deer tick, where it will much more aggressively go after and attack livestock and humans, including deer. So I want to spend a couple of minutes and I want to talk about the Gulf Coast tick. This tick has not, to my knowledge, been discovered yet in Ohio. The Gulf Coast tick is a vector of multiple diseases, just like all the other ticks. What is worrisome to me is this tick has been noted that it can vector leptospirosis. And leptospirosis, in terms of veterinary medicine, is a disease that is a fairly devastating disease. If you contract leptospirosis, and we see this in livestock species, we see this in companion animals, including dogs, a very common presentation syndrome for it would be that it causes kidney damage through pyelonephritis, or a bad kidney infection. This is noted for being a zoonotic disease, meaning a human can contract this from an infected dog or infected livestock. And lepto has a predilection for water. It is shed in urine and feces. And the worry that I have would be with the increasing amount of rains that we have and how many pasture sites that we have that are flooded, should the Gulf Coast tick cross over the river and come up into Ohio, where a lot of the use in the Appalachian soil profile is grazing of ruminants, including cattle, it'll find a fairly fertile feeding ground in the cattle population. And my worry would be how many producers would be exposed to leptospirosis through their cattle, as the cattle urine and defecate in a flooded pasture and maybe lie down or walk through that. The producer could potentially be exposed when they're working their animals without knowing that they have that exposure risk. So I'm personally monitoring the Gulf Coast tick because I want to find out when it's going to spread into Ohio. I don't want to use the words, one of the nice things about it, but it does have some distinct colorations and distinct markings. So if we start finding some different ticks that we find look a little bit unusual compared to what we're normally used to, hopefully we'll be able to make some rapid identification. So here is a slightly blurry picture from 2016 of the host range of the Gulf Coast tick. And what its normal habitat would be is just like its name, the Gulf Coast. So it likes sort of that grassy, marshy habitat in lowland areas along the coast up here. We're starting to see some spread areas in a couple of different extensions through the host habitat, and one of them is it looks like we're spreading up through the river valley as it heads towards Ohio here. And then if you look at this one right here, this one doesn't seem to match, but what happened was several decades ago, there was a cattle shipment that came out of the Gulf Coast area up into Arkansas and Oklahoma into these grazing lands. And that cattle shipment contained cattle that did have Gulf Coast ticks on them. And unbelievably, when the ticks got there, even though that was nowhere near what they would normally live on, they rapidly adapted into that grassland habitat and having food nearby. So this extension of their host range through here was due to the assistance of invasive spread through cattle shipments. So how do we protect ourselves as people? And what I tell folks is to reinforce this point is you do not want to get bit at all if you can help it. There's several things that you can do in order to minimize your risk from ticks. One is I counsel people to make a personal protective plan for their family, including all family members. This includes long sleeves and long pants. Ideally, you would wear light colored clothing because that will make identification of most of the darker colored ticks easier on your clothing. You want to do frequent tick checks. You want to make sure that when you're outside in any kind of tick habitat, which is about every habitat, that before that 12-hour time period's done, that you have examined yourself to find ticks. And what happens when a tick is questing and it grabs you is it starts walking up to its preferred feeding location. And all of the ticks have their preferred areas that they like to hide before they can hunker down and start feeding on their host. In companion animals, we would very commonly find that around the head, around the ears, around the muzzle, in places where the dog would not be able to remove the tick on their own. You want to make sure that companion animals are included in your personal protective plan because a companion animal can be a tremendous hole in your biosecurity. They don't have the ability to do self-tick checks. Different species have much different varying thicknesses and colorations of hair coat that can make identification of a tick on the pet very difficult. There's a number of outstanding products that are out there to make sure that you have gotten the full protection from your companion animal. I recommend you contact your veterinarian and you and your veterinarian come up with how you will do that best knowing your pet. There's a number of different products with applications such as collars, oral medications that can be taken, and then there's topical spot-ons. And while every veterinarian does not carry every single product because that would be unfeasible in terms of inventory, every veterinarian carries at least a couple different ones to make sure they serve their clientele. So if you have a pet that is difficult to orally medicate, you can get a topical. If you have a pet that likes to swim all the time and you're worried that you might cause some dilution of the product, you can get an oral medication. but make sure you get something. I recommend to all of the folks on this webinar to make sure that you get whatever fits best in your budget that you can to protect your companion animals so that you do not have that biosecurity hole. So let's talk a little bit about DEET and permethrin. DEET is a repellent, and I don't consider DEET the ideal prevention strategy for ticks for a couple of different reasons. One is ticks are fairly resistant to DEET. They need a much higher concentration of exposure to DEET than other insects or arthropods would need. I sort of made a little hierarchy in my mind, or when I was talking to clients about what the different insects and arthropods would be in terms of a toughness scale, and sort of the weakest and easiest to kill on the bottom was mosquitoes. And as we moved up the scale, they started to armor up a little bit. So a little tougher than mosquitoes would be lice. And then as we go up, we start getting a little armor on critters that we want to make sure that we address, like fleas or like mites. Ticks are fairly difficult to kill. They do have some armor on them. And then as we get to the very top, which is the strongest and meanest and toughest on the block that I did not really encounter in private practice, but worries me nonetheless, and that would be bed bugs. But ticks require at least 25% DEET minimally to have any kind of repellent activity on there. When I do presentations at some of the forestry groups or AEP or Gladfelter, they provide 100% DEET to their employees to use as a repellent. One of the things that I don't really like about DEET is it does have systemic absorption, and it can rapidly disseminate into the host. And when we talked earlier about how a tick hunts, they're not flying around or sensing like a mosquito is going to do that. They're just going to grab you. And DEET is applied topically. So if they're grabbing you on your clothing, they may not encounter the DEET until much later in the process. And if you've already bathed yourself or you're sweating outside, you might be decreasing the effectiveness of your DEET product. So what I use and what I recommend to folks to do is to do the research on permethrin treating your clothing and your gear. Permethrin is the synthetic pesticide derived from pyrethrum from the chrysanthemum flower. It comes in lots of different preparations. You need to make sure that if you are treating your clothing for it, you use the label variety for treating clothing, because it comes in lots of different preparations. In fact, there are topical preparations to treat things like head lice that I don't recommend at all. The Tick Encounter website that I referenced earlier has outstanding YouTube videos and how-tos on how you would use a spray or a concentrate to treat your clothing. And the nice thing about permethrin treated clothing is that it is fairly resistant during a wash cycle so that it won't rinse off immediately. And so you can get multiple washes depending on how you do your treatment method. If you're not comfortable treating, I can tell you that pretty much any outdoors related companies carry permethrin treated clothing now from all layers of companies, from LL Bean to Columbia to REI to Tractor Supply. And that's very, very commonly found nowadays. The United States military and the British military have permethrin treated clothing for soldiers for quite some time. The other thing you want to do is you make sure that you learn the proper removal methods. Back in practice, I pretty much guarantee I've heard them all, from matches to Vaseline to diesel fuel. But what you want to make sure that you do is you use either tweezers or one of the tick removal tools so that you can gently push down on the skin around the tick so that you could grab the mouth parts, which are deeply embedded in, and they're designed that way because as the tick feeds on its host and engorges with blood, it can enlarge by weight up to 200 times from its original weight. You want to make sure that you get the entire tick out, including the head. One of the common problems that occur with tick removal is sometimes the abdomen may be grasped and pulled out, leaving the tick head embedded, and that can cause a local reaction and infection at that site. You also do not want to grab the abdomen to pull that off because you might basically inject some of those gut contents back into the host, which could cause further problems. And then you want to save that tick. You want to save that tick because there are a number of different testing laboratories nowadays that they can test that tick for a number of the most common diseases that are vectored by ticks. And that's very helpful because you would not want to wait until you started to get sick before you would go into the doctor or start the process that way. The most common presentation for the majority of tick vector diseases to people would be flu-like symptoms. And flu-like symptoms encompasses a wide range of different diseases. So by getting testing on that tick, what that tells you is, was that tick carrying the disease in the first place? That doesn't necessarily tell you if it was transmitted to you or to your companion animal, but I will say as a clinician, the faster you get a diagnosis and the sooner that you start treatment, the greater your chance of a successful outcome. So, tick diseases are prevention diseases. I like to use the seatbelt analogy, and the seatbelt analogy that I use in presentation is you wear your seatbelt so that if you are in a car crash, you are doing your best to prevent devastating injury. You can leave your seatbelt off. You can let the EMTs and the orthopedic surgeons do their best job on you, and they will do that. But by wearing a seatbelt, you are trying to prevent that problem. So a personal protective strategy plan for yourself and for your family is designed to prevent all of the exposure. If you can prevent a tick disease, then you can prevent the disease symptoms from even getting starting in there. Make sure you develop a plan and make sure you include your companion animals in that plan as well. So let me just touch a little bit on something that has happened new in about the last year or so in the invasive tick world here in the United States. And what happened is in the late summer, early fall of 2017 in New Jersey, a sheep farmer was shearing one of their animals, and they noticed that this animal was completely covered with thousands of ticks. And so he took a sample to the veterinarian. The veterinarian looked at it, and they were suspicious because they could not make an identification. And so they had some government officials come to start working on that, and working in the paddock and around the sheep in the barn. The ticks were so numerous that they were crawling in the thousands up on the investigators. And what they found was that sheep, and as a side note, neither that sheep nor the producer had been anywhere near East Asia, but they found that the longhorn tick, which is a brand new invasive tick in the United States, normally found in East Asia, had somehow set up shop in New Jersey. Since that point, they have gone through old samples, and what they're finding is they think around maybe 2010, it entered into the country, probably on an animal, either a livestock shipment or possibly from a dog that had done some international travel over to East Asia. And the problem with this tick is it really transmits some absolutely devastating diseases. It has since been found in 9 different states from New Jersey, and that was with the New Jersey officials trying very hard to eliminate the tick from that habitat and from the host sheep back in the fall of 2017. This is a very, very difficult tick to kill. It is an aggressive biter. This one does like grassy areas, more similar to the American dog tick. And it has a unique thing about it that really is going to negatively force multiply what it can do, and that is it can reproduce through parthenogenesis. And what parthenogenesis basically means is a female does not need a male to breed, and it can just start spontaneously laying eggs. When they sampled all of the New Jersey ticks in and around that paddock and that farm, they found that they were all clonal. So on the top of this slide, it says entry suspected in 2013. I've seen 2010 and 2013 both listed. What they don't know and what they're studying is, does this tick, will it be able to serve as a vector of the common diseases in our area, like Lyme or Rocky Mountain spotted fever? In its normal host range, it does vector different forms of anaplasmosis and different forms of Ehrlichia than we have here. So the worry that we would have would be that should it encounter a infected animal and feed on it that carries some of the diseases over here, that it would actually be able to start vectoring those diseases here. And so what they did is they studied the areas that it lives over in East Asia in terms of topography and habitat and temperature in order to figure out where this tick would be able to exist here in the United States. And unfortunately, what they found is that it would find habitat suitable for the majority of the eastern half of the United States, because this tick can adapt to a wide range of temperature habitats from as low as sub-freezing at 28 degrees to very, very hot to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And so this is a tremendous worry because it's a very aggressive biter, especially to livestock. It transmits a number of different devastating livestock diseases, and it transmits some pretty severe diseases to humans that are in the viral disease category. So a worry that I have when I look at it is this is one that is going to be fairly common to miss when you look at it and you're trying to do identification, because on the right you can see the longhorn tick is not very distinctive in its coloration patterns, like say the Lone Star tick or the American dog tick or the deer tick, where they have very distinctive colors that even with the naked eye you can do a basic identification. These are just common brown looking ticks, and their most common look-alike neighbor is the most commonly found tick in the United States, which is the brown dog tick. So I worry that identification and track of spread of this tick is going to be hampered by its commonality in terms of coloration. This is a timeline that I pulled off of lots of different articles that I look at to show you how rapid the spread is from this. And I don't think this includes any of the old data. This is some fairly rapid data. Arkansas is a real outlier in the middle of that in June, but basically within a year, it had fairly commonly moved through a number of different states and is now found in 9 different states. As an Ohio resident, they have not yet found this here in Ohio, but there are 3 border states that it has been found at. And I was just reading a paper that the CDC has that is in its ready for print. So it's not in its final stage on there, but there was a group of researchers on Staten Island that what they did is they trapped and anesthetized 16 deer just to see exactly where the longhorn tick was in terms of number. And those 16 deer had over 850 longhorn ticks on them as a group. And so one of the things that this tick does is, because of its parthenogenesis, it can breed tremendously in a local space. And when you get large numbers on an animal like deer or like livestock, it can not only vector tremendously devastating diseases, but that number of ticks all sucking blood can cause some anemia concerns as well. So if you want some more information on that, the United States Department of Agriculture has a fact sheet out there that is ready for disbursement out to your various outreach groups and your clientele that you serve. And then, as I said earlier, the Tick Encounter website could not possibly be a better resource for educators to use. I want to fully credit them for the pictures that I had in this presentation. I use them all the time. You have great pictures on tick identification. They have the links on how to do tick testing. They have the links on how you would treat your clothing or where you would go if you wanted to send your clothing to be treated. And then they have a link up here called Tick Spotters, which is really interesting, where volunteers record the ticks that they find in the various places all throughout the United States in different regions and send that data in, so you can see sort of where the trends are in which species and what life cycle they're in your area. So if anybody has any questions, I'm going to pop up into the chat box and see what I can do about addressing those. If you need to get a hold of me, I work here at Ohio State University in Extension in Franklin County, and that is my email at the bottom, McDermott15. Let's see if I can figure out the chat box. We got Q&A.
You've got a couple there. One is, how do they separate out Lyme disease cases contracted outside of the state, say while on vacation, but then diagnosed back in Ohio, versus cases where the contraction and diagnosis all happened within the state? do all of the show up on the chart?
So that is a good question, and I don't have a good answer for that. The data charts that I pulled all off of the Ohio Department of Agriculture that keeps those. There is a time lag between diagnosis and location that if you're traveling that can impact where that data set would fall. And one example of that actually personally affected my family over Thanksgiving. So my brother came, we all went to grandma's up in Youngstown, and he brought his dogs. And I can tell you that it did not get above 24 degrees in Youngstown, Ohio for the Thanksgiving 4-day weekend. They were out in my folks' yard. They did a trip to Mill Creek Park to let the dogs run around. And several days after my brother got back to the Washington, D.C. area, his dog fell ill. They took it into the veterinarian. They found an American dog tick on that dog. They tested the dog, and he was positive for Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So the fact that he was there for a full 4 days and they were able to kind of do, while it's very unspecific and very inexact to guess how long a tick has been on a host by the engorgement of it, they're fairly confident that that was picked up in Youngstown based on the fact that the dog was there for so long. And so one of the things that's unusual is it was extraordinarily cold, and normally the American dog tick would not be that active in there, but you only need one. And so where would that data set fall? Would that fall in Washington, D.C., or would that fall in Youngstown, Ohio? I don't really know.
Okay. Is there any indication that the Lone Star tick can transmit the meat allergy to animals like cats and dogs, or does this only affect humans?
I have not seen any data on that. That would be very, very devastating because potentially, depending on what dog food blend or what cat food blend the animal was being fed on, it would be a tough diagnosis. Although I will say that companion animals very commonly react to food allergies the same way that a human would react to alpha-gal allergies. Now, it really brings it down to immune systems, I guess. So I would say that there's a potential for that if their immune system would react that way. But immune systems are funny things, and they're individual per person, much less per species in terms of per individual. So I would say it's possible. I'm not sure if anybody's doing any research on that. I don't know of any research on that. And especially for cats, which are obligate carnivores and have to eat meat in order to get all the amino acids they need, that would be a pretty devastating syndrome.
Thank you. Another question here says, I understand that Dr. McDermott is talking from experience in Ohio. Has he spoken with people in New Jersey that support that New Jersey should also be concerned 12 months out of the year because of the similar weather issues?
Yes, quite honestly, the data that I use has all come from Ohio, but if I moved to New Jersey tomorrow, I would be just as vigilant about my tick protocols and learning how I can do all of the same things that I recommended in there. Personally, I think that the longhorn tick, which is pretty much spread throughout New Jersey now, I think it's only a matter of time before it's in Ohio, and that would not shock me if it was in Ohio right now. It's a matter of it needs to be discovered, and it needs to be turned in with positive identification through testing. And when you look at how rapidly ticks can spread, and the longhorn tick actually will bite birds. At least it's done that over in East Asia. So that when you look at how far a bird can fly in its migration, and when you look at even for deer, when we have a juvenile buck that is driven out of its host habitat by the mature buck that lives in that habitat, they'll go miles to reestablish a habitat that way, and they can swim across the river as well. And as I saw when I was researching through CDC data today, the number of ticks that can be found on even one deer can number into the hundreds. Those deer were anesthetized for only 15 minutes. So they did that tick collection, 16 deer, 855 ticks of all various life cycles. So my worry would be that host range that they postulate that species of tick is going to invade is probably pretty spot on, quite honestly.
Well, this has been very interesting. I'm not seeing any more questions right now. You will be receiving, everyone who attended today, you will be receiving your email tomorrow, and it will also include Dr. McDermott's email address. So if you think of something along the way and you want to ask him another question, you can do it that way. But right now, boy, this has been a great presentation and a lot of very good and useful information. So Tim, I really appreciate you doing this for us, and yeah, we will. This is being recorded and will be put on the emeraldashboar.info website on the EAB University page. So anyone who was not able to watch it today, please let them know that it will be available to see. It'll probably be posted either tomorrow or Thursday. So with that, thank you again, Tim, and everybody go out there and check your animals.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you very much. There's one question from Lori that I'll address really quick. It is, what happens to a tick that is fully engorged, right? So they're going to fall off at some point, and they're going to use that protein blood meal that they've filled up on, and that is going to be used to fuel their reproductive cycle, and they're going to start laying eggs.
Oh boy. Thank you so much. That came on just right now. So I appreciate you answering that. Anyone else? Like I say, please send Dr. McDermott your email, and from there on, I guess we can all go on and enjoy the rest of our day. And everyone stay safe out there. I know some of us where we are, the weather is not so kind today. So thank you again. And next week, we do not have Emerald Ash Borer University, but that will be coming up, our next one will be coming up in March. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending.